I would invite you this morning to open your Bible to Joshua chapter 22 this morning. Joshua chapter 22. And we begin today the third and final section of this book. Written almost 1,400 years before Christ, 3,400 years ago from our perspective. We come now to the finale of this book. Let me remind you of where we have come from. The first section of this book, the first 13 chapters, encompass the crossing of the Jordan and the initial conquest under Joshua. As Joshua took the reins of leadership from Moses, he led the people across the Jordan. He prepared them. He reminded the eastern tribes of the great promise that they had made to Moses. And the initial conquest of the natives he oversaw, scattered throughout the land, both in the south and in the north. And that was the first section of this book. The second section then, chapters 14 through 21, was the allocation of the land, particularly the western side of the Jordan to the 9.5 tribes that were allocated space there. First, Judah to the south in the largest section, the sons of Joseph in the center, and then the remaining 7.5 tribes receiving land scattered amongst some of the other tribes, Judah and Ephraim and Manasseh, but concentrated primarily in the north, along with, as we saw last week, the 48 cities that were given to the Levites, including the 6 cities of refuge that were established geographically throughout the land. Section 1, then, the crossing of the Jordan and the conquest. Section 2, the allocation of the land. And now, Section 3, the epilogue of this book. The final words of both the conquest and of the life of Joshua. The final words involving all of this conquest and allocation, and then also the finality of Joshua's life. Here in chapter 22, we're going to talk about completing the conquest as the eastern tribes return home, and then in 23 and 24, we will complete the life of Joshua himself by looking both at his charge to the leadership of Israel along with the covenant renewal that he does at Shechem. Now, just a brief administrative note here. It is possible, in fact, it is very possible, that somebody other than Joshua penned what starts in chapter 22. We know, don't we, that the very end of the book must have been penned by someone other than Joshua because it records Joshua's death. Unless he had some ability to send down a written work from after death, it is highly likely that someone else wrote that. So we already know there's parts of this book that were written by someone else. But it's very possible that someone else wrote this as well. In chapter 22, the chapter we're going to be looking at this morning, Joshua is conspicuously absent from the chapter. He doesn't appear at all in this text. That would potentially indicate that this event occurred even after his death, and somebody else included it. And it's also very reasonable to assume that the summary that you see at the end of chapter 21, verses 43 to 45, are the last words that Joshua wrote in this book as he concluded it. You remember we looked at the end of that, and if you look at those 5 or so verses there, 3 verses, 43 to 45, what you have is you have an excellent summary of the entirety of the book. The conquests and the allocation are the entirety of the first 2 sections of this book, and so it's very reasonable that Joshua may have written along to that point and then handed the letter over at that point to the people of Israel, and somebody else loyal to him would have written this epilogue and attached it to the end. So that is certainly a possibility. Now, it's also possible, of course, that Joshua wrote these chapters just as much as he wrote the previous ones, and somebody else simply attached his obituary, to the end of the book. That's always a possibility, and most people sort of assume that that's the case. Joshua closes the entire work with the phrase in 24, 26 and following, and Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God. So that could imply that he wrote these words as well, although it could also mean that he wrote just parts before that. Doesn't really It's not really easy to say. The verboseness, by the way, of chapter 22 is consistent with Joshua's verboseness in other chapters prior to this, as we'll see. So it's very reasonable and very possible that Joshua could have written this just as much as someone else. Either way, no matter which way you want to take your opinion on this, chapters 22 to 24 are clearly an epilogue. They complete this work by tying up the loose ends of Joshua's work and life. All right, so let's look at Joshua 22 then this morning, the first part of this third section. Chapter 22 begins with these words. At that time, Joshua summoned the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh, that would be the East Manassites, and said to them, "You have kept all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, and have obeyed my voice in all that I have commanded you. You have not forsaken your brothers these many days, down to this day, but have been careful to keep the charge of the Lord your God. And now the Lord your God has given rest to your brothers, as he promised them. Therefore, turn and go to your tents in the land where your possession lies, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan. Only be very careful to observe the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, to love the Lord your God, and to walk in all his ways, and to keep his commandments, and to cling to him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul." So Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they went to their tents. Now, what I just read to you, along with the rest of the chapter, is a bookend to what we saw at the very beginning of the book of Joshua. At the very beginning of this lengthy story we've been working our way through, when Joshua commanded the eastern tribes to join the rest of Israel in crossing the Jordan and participate in the fight in Canaan. That's in Joshua chapter 1. You remember how this works. When the tribes of Israel arrived from their wilderness wanderings in the territory of Moab to the east of the Jordan, in the days of Moses, when they arrived there, the leadership of the tribes of Reuben and Gad came to Moses and asked him, "Well, can't we just live here? This is a wonderful place, and we'd like to just live here." I wish we had been able to accelerate one chapter beyond what you read this morning, because the very next chapter of Numbers will recount that story, Numbers 32. They came to Moses and they said, "We'd like to live here. It's a good place." Now, Moses' initial reaction was, "Oh, there you go again. Wanting to get out of doing what you're supposed to do." And the tribes of Reuben and Gad said, "No, we'll go with the rest of Israel. We'll provide a fighting group to go with them. We promise we're not abandoning Israel just because we want to live over here. We recognize that the promised land is on the other side of the Jordan, but this is good land as well." And so Moses acceded to their request. He gave them that opportunity. And he made them promise that they would send their fighting men across. Well, at the beginning of Joshua, then, it is Joshua who comes to these men and says, "You remember that promise that you made to Moses? Okay, now is the time for you to join with us and go across." The tribal leaders had agreed. Their wives and their children would remain on the other side of the Jordan. The men of valor from these tribes would go with the rest across the Jordan. And you remember, when the people of Israel crossed the Jordan, it was the leaders of Reuben and Gad and East Manasseh that went in front of all the rest. They were the first ones across because they didn't bring their wives and children with them across the river. They were able to go as the front men, if you will, to the crossing of the Jordan. They were sort of the security detail that went in front of the people of Israel crossing the Jordan. And Moses, you remember, had commanded them, "You are to stay in the fight until the people on the west have rest from their enemies. You are to remain in the battle on the west until the people on the west have rest from their enemies, until the western tribes are sufficiently settled. Until the initial conquest is over. Then and only then would you be allowed to return to the land toward the sunrise, to go back to the Transjordan area." So what we have here then is Joshua addressing these fighting men of Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh who followed the rest of the tribes across the Jordan. They have been involved in the conquest and in the allocation of the land now. Joshua now comes to address them. We know, according to Numbers 26, that this force from Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh is about 110,580 men. About 1/6 of the total amount of men counted in that census. 43,730 from Reuben, 40,500 from Gad, and about half of the 52,000 from East Manasseh, minus any men who may have been lost in this process, either who died from natural causes during this period of time or who were killed in battle. In other words, men aged 20 and older, probably between the ages of 20 and 50, who went to war, who were able to go to war from these 2.5 tribes of the Transjordan. Joshua addresses them, and he gives them leave to go home. He gives them leave to return home. He tells them, as a part of his statement to them, he tells them that they have been faithful to both the promise they made to Moses, which was to join in the fight, and to him. They have been faithful to Moses in obeying Moses and going across the Jordan with the rest of Israel and joining in the fight. They've been faithful to that. And they have also been faithful to the commands that Joshua gave them during this initial conquest. They have done what he has commanded them to do. He gives them high praise for their obedience. And they have been faithful to this promise for more than 5 years. For more than 5 years, somewhere between 5 and 7 years potentially. Now you remember, we talked about this when Caleb was given his allocation in the land. You remember Caleb had said to Joshua, I was 40 when we went in to spy out the land. Remember that, Joshua? We went in, we spied out, I was 40 years old. I'm standing here now, I'm 85. We spent 37 to 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Therefore, the difference is somewhere between 5 and 7 years, which implies that the conquest of that first section I talked about a minute ago was 5 to 7 years long. These men left their families on the eastern side of the Jordan, joined the western tribes in crossing over the Jordan, and stayed and fought for 5 to 7 years of time. Doesn't really think about that as you're going along, do you? But it's obvious here, isn't it? The fighting men of the fighting men of Reuben, Gad, and East Manasseh have been away from their wives and their children all this time. In fact, Joshua says it right here. He says, you have been faithful many days down to this day. For all this time. And if you've been watching, you will notice that nowhere in the book of Joshua ever is it ever said that the men of Reuben and Gad and East Manasseh complained about the fact that they were with the rest of the tribes. There's no mention anywhere of any grumbling by these men or any complaining or whining, I want to go home. No, Joshua's praise is on top of a people who have been faithful. They have never complained. They have never grumbled. They have literally kept the charge of the Lord their God. Joshua gives them a statement of great praise upon these fighting men. They have sacrificed the comforts of home and the presence of family to put themselves in personal danger, to go across as soldiers and to go up against the enemies of Israel, to fight in battle after battle after battle. I mean, we remember how many we saw when we looked at the southern and northern conquests under Joshua. They put themselves in this great danger all this time in order to keep their commitment to Yahweh. They stayed and they fought. And Joshua gives them great praise. So now that the western tribes are settled, quote unquote, it is time for the eastern soldiers to return home. Now, in my opinion, I don't really think this is opinion, but in my opinion, the initial conquest under Joshua was never intended by Yahweh to be a complete conquest. That was never the intention. We have a tendency to walk into the book of Joshua and assume that, don't we? Okay, God has given you this land, go and wipe out all the natives down to the very last man, woman, and child in the land. No, that's probably not what was being intended here. It is likely that Yahweh only intended for Israel to enter the land, to conquer the major cities and enemies, settle into some of the territory in that land, and then spread out by the overthrow of the remaining natives over time. That Yahweh was giving the power points, if you will, in the land to the people so that they could settle there, but it was never Yahweh's intention for the entirety of the conquest to be accomplished under Joshua. We know from reading the rest of the story, as you read through Judges and 1st and 2nd Samuel, that this conquest takes 400 years to accomplish. And so it was never intended for Yahweh to accomplish it completely under Joshua. Specifically then, the eastern tribal men that go, these men of valor, are not being commissioned forever. They're not being commissioned to go across and stay there until every single Amorite and Canaanite is gone. No, that was never God's intention. God had purposed for an initial conquest in which the eastern tribes would participate in, but he would then free them to return home and continue the conquest of their own land on the other side of the Jordan, on the eastern side, over time as well. Just as the western tribes would have to continue the conquest of the natives on the western side, so the eastern tribes would have to do the same. Don't think for a second that all of the Moabites on the other side of the river have been done away with, as though Israel occupies every square inch of that land. They do not. The conquest has to continue there. So Yahweh, through Joshua, is freeing them to go home, to return home. Thus, the eastern soldiers, these men of valor who have remained faithful to Joshua and to Yahweh, are to take their commitment up until now and return home with it. That's what Joshua is saying in verse 5 when he says, be very careful to observe the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you. Keep that commitment to Yahweh going. You've been doing that. You've been doing that well. Now take that home with you and teach it to your wives and teach it to your children. They're to commit to him now, not just in being a soldier, but in every aspect of their lives. They're to take that back with them that they have been doing so well for the last 5 to 7 years and bring it back to be fully committed and to love God in every aspect of their lives. In every aspect of their lives. We are told by Joshua here, he instructs them, go home and keep the great commandment. You cannot but notice the parallel, can you, between what Joshua says here and what Jesus himself says when the Pharisees come to Jesus and say, okay, how would you summarize, what's the greatest law? And Jesus would simply quote this. Now, I don't think he quotes it directly, but he's making an obvious allusion to it. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That is the summary of the law. That's been fundamental from the very beginning of the giving of that law. And so Joshua simply says that to these men. Go home and keep the law as it was intended, the spirit of the law. You've been doing excellent with that with me on this side of the Jordan. Now go home and do that on the other side of the Jordan. And teach your wives and your children and all the other men that didn't come for war. Go teach them these things. Bring their commitment home to their wives and children and way of life. You know, we're reminded here that these men with that kind of commitment is a picture of what commitment to Christ really looks like. What commitment to the Lord Jesus Christ really looks like. You see, when you come to Christ, When you come on your knees to Christ with an empty hand of trust and faith in Him, when you put down all of your religion, admit who you are before this God and come before Christ, when you kneel before this Christ and embrace Him as your Savior, you are making a long-term commitment to Him. And it is a commitment that will consume the rest of your existence. Not just the rest of this life, but on into eternity as well. You are making a commitment to Him, a lifelong covenant with Him as Savior and Lord. When we come to Christ, we're not just saying words in which we say, yes, I'm accepting Jesus as my friend or my Savior or my pal or whatever, my grandpa with the clipboard that might give me a few things here and there. No. The gospel of Jesus Christ is a message calling us to absolute commitment to Him for the rest of our existence. And it's not just a commitment to some sort of knowledge of Jesus. It is a commitment to holiness. This is the mistake that far too many preachers make today, is to say to people, listen, you can come to Jesus, but you don't need to worry about holiness. That's not matter. Just pray the prayer, and God will be obligated to let you into some glorious paradise when you die. That is not the gospel, my friends. It's not the gospel. And if that's the gospel you've embraced, you need to throw it out and come to the biblical gospel. The biblical gospel is when you come to this Christ, you're coming on your knees to this Christ to say, I'm committing myself to you in the pursuit of holiness for the rest of my life. Nothing less than that is coming to Christ. Nothing less than that. The pursuit is to absolute allegiance and loyalty to this Christ, just as these men are given high praise by Joshua that they had come across the Jordan, they had obeyed their promise, they had come before and participated in every aspect of that 5 to 7 year journey. They were committed. They obeyed. And that's what we're called to do. The gospel is a message of utter commitment to this Christ, the lifelong pursuit of His goals in us, so that at the end, the words we long to hear will be, well done, good and faithful servant. That's the praise we should be pursuing. That's what our lives ought to be about. That's what I want to hear from Christ. I want to be one of those servants in that parable in Matthew 25 who used what God had given to me, what gifts and talents He had given to me, in such a way that it's obvious when I stand before Christ that I have used them in a way of pursuing Him and His holiness, His ways, His ideas, such that He puts His arm around me and says, well done, good and faithful servant. We need to be like these men, committed, because that's what God calls us to do. Now look at verse 7. Now, to the one half of the tribe of Manasseh, Moses had given a possession in Bashan. Now that would be the eastern side. The territory of East Manasseh would be in the area of Bashan. You remember it was Og, the king of Bashan, was killed by the Israelites in the time that Moses was there. So the East Manassites had come to this place. But to the other half, West Manasseh, Joshua had given a possession beside their brothers in the land west of the Jordan. Okay, so that's just simply Joshua or whoever writing, okay, this, just a reminder, Manasseh is divided into two parts. And remember, we've speculated in the past of why that might be, and there's really no good answer to it, except that it is, okay? So it's a reminder that the tribe of Manasseh is being divided, half of it as land on one side, half as on the other side. But then notice what it says. And when Joshua sent them away to their homes and blessed them, he said to them, go back to your tents with much wealth and with very much livestock, with silver, gold, bronze, and iron, and with much clothing. Divide the spoil of your enemies with your brothers. Okay. So while verse 7 is a reminder that, yes, there's a split in land, it's also a way of Joshua saying that what had been conquered by the tribe of Manasseh also belonged to both halves of the tribe of Manasseh. Both half of the tribes were going to receive some of the spoils of the victory in Canaan. The spoil of the victories in Canaan belonged to the entirety of the tribe of Manasseh. Which then leads to the obvious implication of what it is the writer is saying here. And what he's saying is this. All of the eastern tribes, the 2.5 tribes that will be in the Transjordan, they are entitled to some of the spoils that the western tribes had gleaned from taking cities in Canaan. You remember, we talked about this when we were in the midst of the conquest, that when the Israelites would come to a city, they would kill all the people, but they would keep all the stuff because it was theirs. Remember? God had said, this land is yours. It belongs to you now. Those people are living in your city. Get rid of them, and all their stuff belongs to you. So the spoils were belonging to all of Israel, not just the 9.5 on the west. It also included the tribes on the east. And so in verses 7b and 8, then, Joshua is giving a portion of the spoil of your enemies to these 2.5 tribes. That's what he's saying. He's saying, I'm sending you home, but I'm not sending you home empty-handed. I'm sending you home with what is rightfully yours. It is their right because God had given the substance of Canaan to its rightful owners. And it is not only rightfully theirs, but it is also their compensation not returning home empty-handed after 5 to 7 years of being away. Joshua doesn't just say to them, okay, thank you for coming, go home. And they all just sort of walk away empty-handed and go back home. And when they arrive, their wife goes, well, hey, it's great to see you again. What did you bring? And they say nothing. Well, that would have been totally and completely unfair, correct? Because what the people of Israel had taken in the west belonged as much to the people in the east. And so this is what Joshua is doing. Joshua is giving to the tribes in the east, the 2.5 tribes of the east, a portion of that which had been collected by the rest of Israel. It was going to be divided now. So now the leaders of Reuben and the leaders of Gad and the leaders of East Manasseh would go to the rest of the people and they would collect their portion of it. Right? However that would be figured out. Let me ask you a question. Let's just go down this road for a second, all right? What are the spoils of our commitment to Christ? What's in it for me? I know, no, you're not supposed to ask that question, right? What's the spoils? What can we expect to receive in remaining faithful and committed to Christ through all of life? As I said a minute ago, our lives are to be committed to Christ. Okay, so the natural question that might come up, and I think it's a perfectly fair question, the New Testament does address it. Okay, what can we expect? What are the spoils of that for us? Are we supposed to walk into heaven empty-handed? Well, yeah, in the sense that we don't bring our unrighteousness with us. But other spoils. Now, I'm not talking about rewards. Rewards are a different matter. Rewards are, here's what you get for what you did. Because you were faithful in a certain way, I'm going to reward you. That's different than compensation, isn't it? Compensation is what you earn. What you are rightfully due because of what you did. What is the spoils of the Christian faith? I'm not exactly sure how to answer that, but here's the thought that came to my mind. Whether it came from the devil or came from the Spirit, I'll leave that up to you. Right now, there's an interesting celestial event taking place. You may not be aware of it, but it is called a planet parade that's taking place. It's a rare thing. It doesn't happen that often, but it's happening even now. In fact, tonight, December the 12th, it'll be at its peak. If you go on if we have clear skies, I don't think we will tonight, but if we do have clear skies, and this will still be visible over the next few days, if you go outside just after sunset and look towards the south and west, you will see a very bright star. Well, that's not a star, it's the planet Venus. And from Venus and working up in the sky towards in the opposite direction, will be a parade of planets. First, you will see Venus low in the sky, and then slightly above it, you'll see the planet Saturn. It'll be a dimmer star, but it'll be brighter than the typical star. If you have a good pair of high-power binoculars, you probably can see its rings. And then you'll see the planet Jupiter, which will be a nice bright star. It'll be obvious, okay? And then, you can't see it with the naked eye, but with a high-powered pair of binoculars, you can see both Uranus and Neptune in the sky next. The moon will be off to this direction. And then, if you have a very high-powered telescope, beyond the moon, you will see a dwarf planet called Ceres, which is in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, will also be very visible. There's a planet parade that's occurring. Now you say, so what? I'm one of those who's been fascinated by looking into the night sky and seeing the things that are out there and marveling at what's there. And we live in a time unparalleled in human history because we placed 30 years ago a orbiting telescope. Its name is the Hubble telescope. Just this past week they were having some software problems with it, but they managed to correct those and it's back up again. Some years ago, they pointed Hubble at a dark spot in the sky. They're kind of wondering, what's there? It's kind of dark right there. Don't know what's there. So they pointed it there. They opened the lens on the front of it, and they just let it collect light for like a week. And then when they developed the picture, what they saw in the picture was 1,000 galaxies. Not stars. Galaxies of stars in that spot. And Hubble has been able to take pictures of tens of thousands of galaxies that are out there. There are literally billions of galaxies all around us. We live in one small one, kind of in the middle. And I think to myself, Lord, you spoke all of this into existence. What a massive waste of space. But it's not. Because I'm convinced, my friends, that all of that is the spoils that is waiting for us as believers. How long will it take us as human beings, once freed from this sinful, fallen flesh, when there's no longer greed and envy and evil and sin of every kind, when we're able to use the capacities and gifts and talents that the Lord has given us as human beings, when He turns us loose in this world to enjoy His infinite creativity, how long will it take to explore several billion galaxies? In fact, there was an astronomer not too long ago who estimates that the number of planets in this universe approaches 7 to the 12th. Which is 7 million trillion planets. 7 million trillion. How long will it take for us to explore all of that? Can you say forever? I am convinced that the spoils of our commitment to Christ is this universe that Christ Himself has broken into and redeemed and given to His elect to enjoy and explore forever, with Him amongst us, with Him here, with the Spirit of God, the third person of the Trinity, who we often forget about in eternity, but the third person of the Trinity also going before us and helping us to see all these wonderful places. Imagine what engineering science will look like without sin. The redemptive work of the one born in Bethlehem is to give to his own everything that was lost when the first Adam sinned and was driven from the garden to toil in the dirt. When he gives us back everything that he formed and created. Not by accident, my friends, but with purpose. These are the spoils. This is what we're given. The enemy thought he could take it from us. But the Christ has come to give it back to us. Now, don't ask me how that's going to work. I don't really know. But I know some very smart people in this world that if they were freed from their envy and their guilt and their sinfulness, that they could do unbelievably remarkable things because God gave them such gifts. Which leads then to verses 10 to 34. Now, some of you are looking at your watch right about here and going, how in the world is he going to fit in 25 verses in the remaining time? Well, we're going to get them in. But we're going to do it like this. You remember I said at the beginning that Joshua has a tendency to be somewhat verbose. He writes the story with a lot more detail than what is really needed to understand the story. He gives it in this really, really long story. So what I'm going to do for you this morning is summarize these 25 verses into a much shorter storyline. As these Eastern soldiers are returning home, they have been given leave by Joshua now to go and return home to their places. They pause at the River Jordan and build an imposing altar at the river's edge. And they do it on the western side of the river. Not the eastern side. They do it on the western side. They do it on the Canaan side of the river. They build an imposing altar there. I imagine it's a huge structure. Now, they build this and then they go home. Okay, so they cross the river and go home. Now, news of this altar spreads throughout the rest of the tribes living on the western side of the Jordan. There's 9.5 tribes that are living in Canaan. They hear about this altar and they assemble at Shiloh. Remember, that's where the tabernacle is. That's where the priests are doing the sacrifices. So they all come the leaders all come to Shiloh, and they decide to make war against the Reubenites, the Gadites, and East Manassites. They decide to make war against them because the altar offends them. It offends them. Now, again, as I said earlier, Joshua is conspicuously absent from this story. All right? You would think this would be the spot where Joshua would step in and say something, but he's not there, which has led some to believe that he might be dead at this point that this occurs, that this happens after he dies. He sends them home during his lifetime. They build the altar, but the offense of the altar doesn't come until later when they hear about it and it starts building up and building up and building up. Don't know. So, in verses 13 to 20, we are told that the western tribes send a delegation across the Jordan to confront the Transjordan tribes. This delegation is headed by a man by the name of Phinehas, the priest. He is the son of Eleazar. You mentioned him in the chapter we looked at this morning, or you read this morning. He is heading this delegation along with the 10 tribal chiefs from each of the western tribes. It is the inclusion of this priest, by the way, that tells us the nature of the offense. He is the one, Phinehas, he is the one who presented his zeal against those who had fallen into Baal worship at Peor, which you also mentioned this morning, when they reminded again. Remember in the days of Balaam, when Balaam had come and convinced the people to do this and that in the favor of the king that he was serving, and they all fell into Baal worship, okay? And Balaam is killed in the chapter that you read this morning, okay? This is a reference to that event. But it is Phinehas, who is the guy who has that zeal from there now here. So he has the same zeal. He's a hot-headed priest, okay? And he's about to head across the Jordan with this tribal delegation because they've heard about this altar. And their complaint is as follows. come across and they say to him, look, building an altar for yourself outside of the one at the tabernacle implies that you intend to worship Yahweh at that altar rather than with the rest of Israel at Shiloh. You built an altar in a place not at the tabernacle, which implies that you're intending to use it to worship Yahweh there. Such an act is a clear violation of the law of God. You can't do that. It's a clear violation of the law of God, who commanded us to worship him in a single place. The tabernacle is the place of worship. Thus, your altar that you have built will bring down the wrath of God upon us all. You understand that what you have done has evoked the wrath of God, not just upon you, but upon all of us as well. All of us who are trying to remain faithful to God at the tabernacle at Shiloh, you brought the vengeance of the Lord down upon us all. God will do to us again as he did at Peor. The priest, by the way, brings up the incident that he himself had been involved in, purging the people of Israel of their Baal worshipers. And he reminds them of that. Remember, we had to do this before, when we worshiped Baal and God brought down vengeance upon us all. He's going to do it again. So if you believe that your land here in the Transjordan is unclean, meaning it's insufficient for you, it's not enough space, or you're not amongst us or whatever, fine. Bring your people then across the Jordan into Canaan, and we'll give you some land amongst us. In other words, if you feel that it's unfair that you guys are stuck over here on this side of the Jordan, even though that's what you wanted, then just bring your people over here. Don't do this kind of thing, which is just going to bring down the wrath of God upon our heads. In other words, don't rebel against the Lord with this altar and bring down upon us the same punishment that came upon Achan. Remember that? Remember the story after Jericho where Achan kept some of the spoils from the city and hid them under his tent? And the Lord brought vengeance down upon the people of Israel, and Achan wasn't the only one that died because of that sin. All of his family was destroyed as well. Don't bring down the wrath of God where many die for the sin of the one. That's their complaint. Now, here's how I would characterize the response of the Reubenites and the Gadites and the East Manassites. Whoa, wait a minute, hold it, time out. You are misinterpreting us. We fully agree with you that a substitute altar for worship of Yahweh is wrong. We know that. And we know that any such altar deserves the vengeance of God. However, the Lord knows that's not what we were intending. We call upon Yahweh himself to stand as a testimony to us. That's not what we were intending to do. However, we built this altar not as an altar of sacrifice. We built it as a monument. And we built it specifically as a monument, not an altar of sacrifice, to remind future generations in the West that we in the East are still a part of the people of Israel and should be allowed to worship with them at Shiloh. In other words, it will be the natural inclination over time for you people in the West to forget about us in the East. It'll be the natural inclination of you to forget about us. Because there's a boundary between us, right? There's a river between us. And you probably won't ever come over that river and see us on the other side. You'll live over there, and in a few generations, your people over there in the West will forget about us over here in the East. This structure, then, we have built will serve as a monument to our inclusion in all of Israel. Now, this is not the first memorial built in this book, is it? We've seen a few others, haven't we? The first one, of course, is the one at Gilgal, after the Israelites crossed over the Jordan in chapter 4, verse 20. Remember, they stacked up 12 stones, one for each tribe as they went across. They made a monument. This is where we crossed the Jordan. They built a monument over Achan's body. Isn't that ironic? That this priest comes complaining about what happened to Achan, and he doesn't even notice the irony that they're building a monument, not an altar. They built one over Achan's body to remind the people, don't do that again. There was one that they built over the king of Ai after they killed him, chapter 8, verse 28. They put a monument in front of the cave where they sealed in the Amorite kings, you remember, in chapter 10, verse 27. All of these monuments had a purpose. They had a message. What's the message of the monuments? Only Yahweh is to be worshipped and in precise obedience to his command. All of these monuments testify to there is one God. He is to be worshipped, and he's to be worshipped in the way that he specifies. Which is exactly what we're saying with our monument, these Reubenites and Gadites and East Manassites say. We built an altar. We built a monument. We built a monument to remind you, yes, there's only one way to worship God. Yes, there's only one way to worship Yahweh. We know that. So don't forget us. Don't exclude us from that just because we live on the other side of the river. So in 30 to 34 then, the delegation of the West accepts this explanation and admits their error. They return to Canaan and report their findings of what they had discovered. Notice they don't break out in war. No civil war starts here because they recognize that what their eastern brothers are saying is true. They go back and they assure the western tribes that their assumption was incorrect and that the Transjordan tribes only built a reminder to their true worship of Yahweh. In fact, at the end of the chapter, we're told that the eastern tribes named the altar Witness. Witness. A witness between both sides that Yahweh is God and that they are all, on both sides of the river, under his authority and under his form of worship. It's a witness between us, they say. And the western tribes understand it. Now, that's 25 verses to get that out, okay? But you see what's happening. As these people from the east go back home, the very real danger that they perceive on their way back is they may forget about us. They may forget us. I mean, we're just a small couple of tribes over there on the other side, and they're probably not going to come over there very often. They're going to forget about us. They're going to forget that we're there. We need to put something up to remind them that we're just as much as part of them as they are of us. And that's the point of the rest of this story. And I confess that I wrestled with how to apply that until the Lord said, hey, there's a direct application of this to your life. Don't go around it. Okay, here it is. Here we have a tangible reminder to us in this text that Grace Fellowship Baptist Church of Robertsdale, Alabama, is actually one church with two distinct locations. Now the folks in Phillipsburg suddenly woke up. Like, hey, you're talking about me. You're talking about us. Yes, I am talking about you. We are one family, but with two distinct locations. Yes, I agree, there's a 1,200-mile boundary between us, yes. Takes a whole day to get there by car. There's a boundary, but it doesn't make us two distinct churches. We're still one family, one single church with a single mission, worshiping the singular Jesus Christ. For the moment, we are a single family as two different churches. And we have included them, their names and addresses and phone numbers and email addresses, on our church directory as our monument, as a reminder to us that they are a part of us and we are a part of them. It would be real easy for us sitting here in Robertsdale, right, to simply assume that, oh, there's some people on Zoom, I don't know who they are, but, whatever. But this is an excellent reminder to us, isn't it? That we have chosen as a church to put our arms around those people there, you in Phillipsburg, to put our arms around you, to make you a part of ourselves, and we will not forget you. So, let me suggest to you, for those of you who are using our Christmas mail for missions function this year, it's okay and appropriate to send some cards also to those in Phillipsburg. Or, let me put it to you like this. Go get a copy of that church directory and familiarize with yourself with some of the names of the people on that directory. Now, you may not know their faces, but you can know their names. And you can know to pray for them. And even maybe to email them or text them or even call them to say, hi, my name is so-and-so, and I want to say hello. You don't know me from Adam, but we are part of the same church family. If you should feel led to do so. I couldn't help but notice that as a part of this text. Two different parts of the same people, separated by a physical boundary, and yet the people on the smaller end of that saying, hey, don't forget about us. And we're not forgetting about you. The Eastern fighting men may be returning home, but they are not forgotten. No matter where the Lord may scatter us, we are always a part of his family. There's a local sense of that in Grace Fellowship, but there's also a global sense in that. There are many brothers and sisters who are a part of the church, the true church, that you've never met and scattered all over the world. There are some living in places even today where the idea of gathering together like this is dangerous and could even be fatal, and thus have to meet together in underground places or in places where the authorities cannot find them. We are blessed to be able to live in a place where we can worship freely, at least for the time being. But the Lord may scatter us, either permanently or temporarily, but we are always a part of his family. The memorial altar that binds us together is Christ Jesus himself. He is the altar. It is he who holds his people together across the vastness of time and space. The vastness of time and space will not separate us from the love of God. It will not separate us from the presence of Christ himself. And in eternity, when we go exploring this vast universe, we will never be away from this one. He will always be with us, either present physically with us in his body or by his Spirit with us as we go and as we explore and enjoy all of his creativity. We will never be far from him. But it also reminds us that we are not far from all of those brothers and sisters who've gone before us. Many generations of faithful followers of Christ who have died and have gone off to be with him. It is Christ that binds us all together, generation after generation, in time and space. It is all centered around him, which is what makes this Christmas season so important, because it's the time for us to be reminded again that we find our substance as a family in the one who was born in Bethlehem, who came at his Father's will to draw a people together from everywhere to be his own. And we might be just a small little incarnation of that here and have a little extension of ourselves up there. But nonetheless, it is him who has made us all one in Christ. We are one. Let's not forget those on the other side of the river. Whether that river be the river of time or the river of space or the river of distance. we're all one in him.